Hey everyone, James here from TDB, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I am going to be tackling a rather big topic. I don't think I can get to absolutely everything on this, but going to do my best on talking about what makes a Pu'erhs price. There's a lot of different factors, so I'm trying to break down as much as I can. And I think one kind of interesting exercise that you can do when you're doing this is try to just understand what makes a particular Pu'er or tea's price when you're looking at a vendor, and whether that's for good potential reasons or reasons that maybe don't matter as much to you. So for me, it's usually a lot clearer to do this if you just break it down into sort of individual components and looking at the tea in certain ways. What characteristics does it have? That sort of thing. Because, quality obviously is what you want to make for a tea drinker is kind of the ultimate thing that is satisfying, quality, and whether it fits your kind of personal preferences, but that's not always the case. For instance, okay, so the first one I have on my list is area, so region it's grown. So this, I think, especially applies to newer productions. Older productions, they tend to care a lot less about that. So the area that it's grown, while there is speculation, and it can still play a factor in terms of what the production would cost, in general, people have become very specific, oftentimes hyper-specific, where, originally people were focusing on these kind of larger regions. Then we got, like Munghai County, for instance, then you get down to Bulong Mountain, and then you get into these specific areas within Bulong Mountain, like Lao Ban Zhong, and then you get into even specific farmers and that kind of thing. So this can be fairly broad in terms of are we talking on county prefecture level, or are we talking very, very hyper specific, where it's this farmer's set of trees will get a really high price. So I think this is kind of the thing to pay attention to, especially with new productions. And you'll generally see that there are trends here. So it's Yiwu area tea will generally get a much higher price than Linsong tea. Of course, there are individual sub-regions within Linsong that are going to be more expensive than certain areas within Yiwu too. So, just something to pay attention to, especially if you are someone that is a purchaser of fairly young tea. I think it tends to be a little bit more of a factor, certainly when we get into the regions and micro-regions there. Another thing that makes a factor, of course, is brand. The brand of the tea will definitely have some impact on the price. It's usually kind of in conjunction with things, so the brand alone is not going to necessarily make the price of a tea. For instance, even a fairly high-end brand like Chen Yuan Hao, which is kind of like this boutique Tainan-based Pu'er brand that specializes usually in Yiwu, fairly popular in Malaysia, is generally considered a pretty high-end brand. So they will make a lot of Yiwu tea, some that's really quite expensive. But even within the Yiwu tea they make, it's pretty common for them to make Yiwu tea that's higher end, but they'll also make maybe perhaps a more regular daily drinker batch that is a fraction of the price. So they could have tea that initially is starting to sell for $500, that's Yiwu tea. And they could also have an Yiwu tea that when they're first selling it and the tea is fresh, maybe it's selling for $40 or $50. So significantly less, but they have the same brand in the same area. So the difference is kind of in the quality in that sense. So brand alone isn't going to necessarily make or break a tea, but it can make kind of a big difference there. So I mean, that could be the difference between a bush tea versus kind of an old tree. And the same thing happens with big tea factories. Dai makes a ton of productions a year. Some are huge productions. This is kind of bleeding into my next point, quantity. Some are huge productions where they're making a whole lot of it. And those can still get quite expensive, depending on kind of the demand for them. But if you're making a higher quantity of them, generally speaking, those are the cheaper productions, whereas the special productions are much more limited. And so that can play a big part there. And generally speaking, the quantity will somewhat correlate with quality, where it's if you're making a really small production of something, you're probably going to make it count. You're not probably going to make a small quantity of some really cheap tea. You're going to generally do it for something that's bigger. Of course, that's not going to stop people from making small quantities of something that sucks. That could still absolutely happen. But generally speaking, they will probably be kind of reverse correlated in that way too. So yeah, so it's like, for instance, this is a Shaguan tea. This is a Jiaji tool. So it's something that they make a whole lot of. This one is from 2005. They probably made more in like 2015, let's say, than 2005. So the 2005 is probably going to be a bit of a higher price. Okay, next thing I have on my list is storage. And I think this one is perhaps a bit harder to judge, and it can really be determined by kind of market factors that we are not particularly close to. Generally speaking, if you have kind of some of these other conditions, like you have a Munghai Tea Factory Raw 7542 from 2005, that might be more expensive if you are buying something that's more dryly stored versus something that's more traditionally stored and is a little danker. This one's hard to judge, and I think in general you can more or less avoid looking at this. Storage is obviously, I think personally, I think that's a more important factor when it comes to kind of judging the tea and figuring out what kind of the final product is going to be in the cup. Traditional storage versus like dry storage are very different things and going to result in very different teas. As far as impacting the price, it's complicated, and so while it certainly can have an impact, I think I would not necessarily it would not be the first thing I'm looking to for something. So for like perhaps the biggest impact could be with more aged tea that already has like name and a bit of a pedigree. So something like a Dai 7542 from the 90s. The dry stored version is just going to be much more expensive because partly because the tea, you can't kind of undo traditional storage, and the tea is just kind of in lower quantity. That was not the norm of storage at the time. Okay, and then another thing to keep in mind is how many times the tea has changed hands, as well as the markup. Certain vendors will have different markups. I think one reason why I think I tend to default to Yunnan sourcing as kind of a recommendation for people is the tea generally does not change as many hands when it comes to them. So using them as a source, and let's say each middleman along the way has a bit of a markup, there are just frankly a lot of people that will use Yunnan sourcing as a middleman. In fact, I've seen some people say, "Oh, don't go to Yunnan sourcing, go to this other vendor," and then I'll look at this other vendor, and they'll be selling a bunch of Yunnan sourcing tea. So what did you do there? You just kind of gave money to another person that's kind of in between Yunnan sourcing and them. So as a result, just thinking about this a little bit, obviously this is a little bit of a black box, so it's hard to absolutely know what kind of like a vendor's markup is. Generally speaking, I find that people seem to think that markups are a lot lower than they actually are. But I think that's certainly part of the game and totally fair for vendors to charge a markup to make a living. And there are vendors that, will buy from other vendors and stuff like that. So obviously you don't want to be buying from a vendor that is kind of like sixth or seventh down the line. And this is the reason why you end up generally going to specialists, because the specialists are going to be a little bit higher up that food chain as far as like tea changing hands and that sort of thing. It's usually better to go from from a vendor that's much closer to the source than someone that's a bit further. And, this alone makes quite a big impact. If you are just buying from vendors that are pretty high up the food chain, then I think you can do pretty well for yourself if you can figure that out. For instance, some place like Tea Home, a big reason why I recommend Tea Home is because their prices are extremely reasonable. Why are their prices extremely reasonable? Because they are much closer, they are more or less representative of kind of the Taiwanese market and the prices that you're going to get there. Is their tea always the best? No. Definitely not. But you'll find that their tea is much cheaper, and it's not because it's fake or anything like that. It's just because they are closer and they have kind of one or two layers removed as far as kind of like closeness to the source. And I think the same applies to a couple Pu'er vendors. Pu'er vendors, I find there are definitely a good handful that are a bit closer to the source than kind of. I think there are more kind of tea home equivalent vendors for Pu'er than there are in like Taiwanese oolong or something like that. And then the final thing, of course, is quality. Quality definitely can make a big factor in the price of the tea, and I think that's a good reason to have a higher priced tea. If you are buying a tea to drink, then quality is perhaps the most important factor there. that's something that's really hard to determine if you are just kind of reading the description and that kind of thing. So what you would do is you would basically look at these other factors, perhaps writing them down or just thinking about them, and just kind of, and if you can't come up with any reasons why a tea would be the price that it is, presumably it's because of its quality. There's of course nothing to prevent someone from marking a tea of poor quality for the same price. So that alone is not a great reason to buy the tea, but it is kind of important to note if the vendor thinks that a tea is worth like a certain price and none of these other factors necessarily apply. So, I mean, a good example is a place like White Tea, who does something rather interesting. And I think the main thing they don't do is they don't cover area. So they're basically kind of saying that area is not very important when it comes to the quality of these teas, and they're saying judge the tea by its actual quality of leaves there. Obviously, not everyone loves this. Some people really like to know the origin of the tea, but it is quite bold when you think about it in terms of that. Yeah, so hopefully you all found this video informative and hopefully it wasn't too rambling. Let me know what you think, and I will see y'all next time. Cheers.